A simple drive, an unexpected journey. The sun had already dipped below the horizon when I finally clocked out of my shift at the warehouse. My muscles ached from hours of lifting, stacking, and moving boxes, but the exhaustion was something I had grown used to. It wasn't the most glamorous job, but it paid the bills. And for now, that was enough. As I pulled into my driveway, I noticed an extra car parked outside, one that wasn't ours. Stepping into the house, the familiar scent of baked lasagna filled the air, wrapping me in a warmth that contrasted against the cold evening outside. My mom always made lasagna when we had company, a little tradition of hers that had never changed. At the kitchen table sat Emily, my mom's friend. She had been around for as long as I could remember, a familiar presence at holidays and family gatherings. But tonight, something was different. Her usual confident, radiant energy was gone, replaced by a heavy, distant look in her eyes. Her fingers wrapped tightly around the ceramic mug in front of her, stirring her tea absent-mindedly. "Alex, you're home," my mom greeted, breaking my train of thought. She motioned toward the table. "Come on, join us. Emily's staying for dinner." "Hey, Emily," I said with a nod, dropping my work bag near the door. She looked up, managing a small, tired smile. "Hi, Alex. Long day?" I asked, heading to the fridge for a glass of water. "You could say that," she murmured, her fingers tightening around the handle of her mug. Before I could ask more, my mom chimed in. "Emily's having some car trouble, so I thought it'd be nice to have her over while she figures things out." Dinner was nice, but there was an undeniable tension lingering in the air. My mom, ever the optimist, tried to keep the conversation light, but Emily only responded with small nods and half-hearted smiles. Something was clearly waning on her. After the meal, my mom turned to me with that tone, the one she used when she was about to ask for a favor. "Alex, would you mind driving Emily home? Her car is still at the shop, and it's too late for her to get a ride now." "Sure," I said, shrugging. It wasn't like I had any big plans for the night. Emily looked at me apologetically. "Are you sure? I can call someone." "It's no problem," I assured her. "Let me grab my keys." The drive started off quietly, with only the hum of the engine filling the silence between us. Emily gave me directions to her neighborhood, and I followed them, keeping my eyes on the road. She seemed lost in thought, staring out the window as if her mind was miles away from this car. After a few minutes, I decided to break the ice. "So what happened with your car?" Emily sighed. "Starter's dead. It's an old model, so it's probably time to start looking for a replacement. But you know how it is, life gets expensive." I glanced at her before turning back to the road. "Yeah, I get that. But at least you've got options, right?" She nodded but didn't say anything for a while. Then, out of nowhere, she let out a small, humorless laugh. "Sorry, Alex, I didn't mean to dump my problems on you." "You're not dumping anything," I replied. "Everyone hits rough patches. It's not a big deal." Emily turned to look at me, her eyes soft but tired. "You're a good kid, Alex. Your mom did a great job raising you." I wasn't sure how to respond to that, so I just shrugged and focused on driving. As we got closer to her house, Emily seemed to relax a little. She started talking about her work, how stressful it had been lately, and how she was trying to adjust to life after her recent divorce. I blinked in surprise. "I didn't know you and your husband split up." "It's been a few months," she admitted, her voice quieter. "I guess I didn't want to make a big deal out of it. Everyone's already dealing with their own stuff, you know." "Still," I said, "that's not easy to go through." "It's not," she agreed, "but I'm figuring it out, one step at a time." For the first time that evening, Emily smiled. A real smile. It was small, but it felt genuine. When we finally pulled up to her house, she paused before opening the car door. "Thanks for the ride, Alex, and thanks for listening. I didn't mean to unload all that on you." "You didn't," I said quickly. "Sometimes it helps to talk." She hesitated, like she wanted to say something else but wasn't sure how. Finally, she just nodded. "Good night, Alex." "Good night, Emily." I watched as she walked up the path to her front door, and for some reason, I couldn't stop thinking about her. There was something about the way she had opened up, something raw and honest that I hadn't expected. I had always thought of Emily as just my mom's friend, someone I saw at family events and exchanged polite hellos with. But tonight, she felt like a completely different person, someone real, someone I wanted to understand better. And that realization unsettled me more than I cared to admit. The next morning, I woke up still thinking about our conversation. Driving Emily home had seemed like a small favor at first, but it stuck with me. It wasn't just what she had said, but how she had said it. The vulnerability in her voice, the quiet strength she carried despite everything. Later that afternoon, my mom and I were in the kitchen cleaning up after lunch. She was humming along to the radio in one of her usual good moods. "Did Emily get home okay?" she asked casually, scrubbing a plate. "Yeah," I replied, drying the dishes. She seemed tired, though. I didn't realize she was going through so much. My mom sighed, pausing to look out the window. "Emily's had a rough year. The divorce was hard on her. I keep inviting her over because I don't want her to feel like she's alone." "That makes sense," I said, nodding. "She mentioned she's trying to figure things out." "She's strong," my mom added, turning back to the sink. "But even strong people need a little help sometimes." I didn't say anything, but her words stuck with me. Emily had always seemed so put together, like she had everything figured out. It was strange to think of her as someone who might need support. A few days later, I was running errands when I noticed a familiar figure walking along the sidewalk. It was Emily. She was carrying a few grocery bags, looking slightly flustered. Without thinking, I pulled over and rolled down the window. "Emily, need a lift?" She turned, her face lighting up with surprise. "Alex, what are you doing here?" "Just heading back from the hardware store," I said. "Hop in. I'll give you a ride." Emily hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Thanks. I wasn't expecting the bus to be this late." Once she was settled in the passenger seat, she let out a small sigh. "You're saving me twice in 1 week. I might have to start paying you as my chauffeur." I chuckled. "I'll add it to your tab." The lighthearted banter felt natural, easing the tension from the last time we had spoken. As I drove her home, Emily glanced over at me. "You're a good guy, Alex. Not a lot of people your age would go out of their way for someone like me." "Someone like you," I repeated, confused. She shrugged, a small smile tugging at her lips. "An older woman. Someone your mom's age. Most 25-year-olds don't think about people like me at all." I frowned. "That's not true. You're easy to talk to. Besides, age doesn't matter when someone's worth caring about." Emily looked away, her cheeks faintly pink. For a moment, there was silence. But it wasn't awkward. It felt comfortable. And that scared me more than anything. Unraveling the layers, the following days passed in a blur, but Emily remained in the back of my mind like a song I couldn't shake. It wasn't just about giving her a ride home or helping her with groceries. It was something deeper, something I wasn't sure I was ready to admit to myself. I had never really looked at her before, not like that. Emily had always been just my mom's friend, someone I saw at family gatherings and exchanged pleasantries with. But that image of her, shoulders slumped, voice tired yet honest, had etched itself into my thoughts. She wasn't just some distant acquaintance anymore. She was real. And that realization was unsettling in ways I couldn't quite articulate. A few days later, my mom invited Emily over for dinner again. It wasn't anything out of the ordinary, just another one of those nights where my mom insisted on filling the house with warmth and laughter. But this time, something felt different. When Emily arrived, I noticed how she hesitated at the door, almost like she was debating whether she should even be there. Her eyes held that same distant look from before, but there was something else now, something guarded, like she was trying to keep the world at arm's length. "Emily," my mom greeted cheerfully, pulling her into a hug. Come in, come in. You look like you could use a good meal." Emily forced a small smile. "Thanks. I appreciate it." Her eyes flickered toward me, and I offered a small nod in return. "Hey, Emily." "Hey, Alex." The way she said my name sent an unfamiliar warmth through me, but I pushed it aside. Dinner was delicious. As always, my mom kept the conversation light, doing her best to lift Emily's spirits, but I could tell something was still weighing on her. She laughed when it was appropriate, responded when she needed to, but her smiles didn't quite reach her eyes. Then, just as we were finishing up, my mom gave me that look again, the one that meant she was about to volunteer me for something. "Alex, why don't you drive Emily home again? It's late, and I don't want her waiting on a ride." I wasn't surprised. Honestly, a part of me had been expecting it. "Of course," I said without hesitation. Emily opened her mouth, probably to object, but then she closed it again. Instead, she just exhaled softly and nodded. "Thanks." As I grabbed my keys and we headed outside, I noticed how much colder it had gotten since earlier that evening. The air was crisp, the kind that hinted at the change of seasons. Emily hugged her arms around herself as we walked to my car. "Didn't bring a jacket?" I asked. "Didn't think I'd need one," she admitted with a small chuckle. Without thinking, I shrugged off my hoodie and handed it to her. "Here, you'll freeze otherwise." She looked at me surprised. "Alex, I can't take your—" "Just put it on," I interrupted. "It's not a big deal." She hesitated for only a second before slipping it over her shoulders. "Thanks." As we pulled out of the driveway, the car was filled with the familiar hum of the engine and the occasional sound of passing traffic. At first, we drove in silence, but this time, it wasn't uncomfortable. It was as if neither of us knew quite what to say but didn't mind the quiet. Then, finally, Emily spoke. "Can I ask you something?" she said, her voice quieter than usual. "Of course." She hesitated before continuing. "Do you ever feel like you don't know where you're going? Like you're just moving forward because you have to, not because you have a destination in mind?" The question caught me off guard. It was so raw, so personal, that I wasn't sure how to respond at first. "Yeah," I admitted. "All the time, actually." Emily let out a soft breath, almost like a sigh of relief. I thought I was the only one. "You're not," I assured her. "I think everyone feels that way at some point. It's just that most people don't like to admit it." She nodded slowly, her fingers tracing absent-minded circles against her knee. "After the divorce, I thought I'd feel free, like I was getting a second chance at life. But instead, it's like I've been walking through fog, just hoping I'll eventually find solid ground." I glanced at her, watching the way her expression shifted between vulnerability and uncertainty. "You will," I said, meaning it. "Eventually, the fog lifts." She turned to look at me, and for the first time that night, there was something in her eyes that wasn't sadness. It was hope. "Thanks, Alex," she murmured. By the time we reached her house, I found myself reluctant for the night to end. There was something about talking to Emily that made time feel different, like it stretched and shrank all at once. As she unbuckled her seatbelt, she hesitated. "Do you want to come in for a bit? Just for a cup of coffee?" I hesitated for only a moment before nodding. "Yeah, sure." Inside, her house was warm but quiet. There were still unpacked boxes in the corner, the remnants of a life she was still trying to piece back together. It was the kind of silence that didn't feel empty, but rather unfinished. As she brewed the coffee, I leaned against the counter, watching her. "You never really unpacked, huh?" I observed. Emily let out a small chuckle. "Yeah, I keep telling myself I'll get around to it, but somehow it never happens." "Need help?" I offered. She paused, looking at me carefully, as if trying to figure out whether I was serious. I might take you up on that, she finally said, setting down 2 mugs of coffee. As we sat on her couch, sipping our drinks, the conversation flowed more easily than I expected. We talked about her work, my job at the warehouse, random things that didn't necessarily matter but made the room feel a little lighter. Then, somewhere in the middle of it all, Emily sighed. "You know, I used to paint," she said, staring at the blank wall across the room. "Before life got in the way." I turned to her, surprised. "Really?" She nodded. "Yeah, I used to love it, but I haven't picked up a brush in years." "Why not?" She shrugged, her expression thoughtful. "I guess I just forgot how to start again." I thought about that for a moment, then set my mug down. "Maybe you don't need to overthink it. Just get a canvas, some paints, and see what happens." Emily smiled, but it was different this time. Softer, like she was actually considering it. "You make it sound so simple." "Sometimes it is," I said. "You just have to take the first step." She stared at me for a long moment, something unreadable in her expression. "You're wiser than most people your age, you know that," she said with a small laugh. I shrugged. "I just say what makes sense." Emily nodded, her smile lingering. "Well, thanks for making sense." That night, as I drove home, I couldn't shake the feeling that something between us had shifted again. It wasn't anything obvious, but it was there, somewhere beneath the surface, waiting to be acknowledged. And the scariest part, I wasn't sure if I wanted to stop it. A line we can't ignore. The next few weeks passed in an oddly comfortable blur. I found myself seeing Emily more often than I had ever expected. At my house for dinner, running into her at the grocery store, exchanging the occasional text message that felt more natural than it should have. It wasn't planned, and yet it kept happening. At first, I told myself it was nothing. Just casual encounters, just friendly conversations. But if that were true, then why did I keep thinking about her long after she was gone? Why did I find myself looking forward to the next time I'd see her? One evening, I got a text from Emily. "Emily, do you happen to know anything about fixing wobbly bookshelves?" I smirked at my phone before typing back. "Me, that depends. Is it wobbly because it's old or because you built it yourself?" Her reply came almost immediately. "Emily, rude, but fair. I may have used too many screws and then panicked halfway through." Me, "I'll be there in 20 minutes. Her house was already familiar to me by now, but stepping inside still felt different every time. It was like entering a story in progress. Half-unpacked boxes, walls that were slowly filling with life again, little signs that she was still trying to rebuild something she had lost. Emily greeted me at the door with an exasperated look and a cup of coffee already in hand. "I figured I should have a peace offering ready before you see my disaster of a bookshelf," she said, handing me the mug. I chuckled. "How bad are we talking?" She led me to the living room, where the bookshelf in question was standing in the corner. And by standing, I meant barely holding itself together. One side was tilted, the shelves were uneven, and I could already see a few screws sticking out at odd angles. I let out a low whistle. "Wow, this is something." Emily groaned, covering her face with her hands. "I know. I swear I followed the instructions." "Are we sure those instructions weren't cursed?" I teased, setting my coffee down and kneeling in front of the bookshelf to inspect it. She nudged me with her foot. "Laugh all you want, but I need you to save it." I got to work tightening screws, adjusting the alignment, and occasionally shooting her a look of disbelief when I found more problems. "You know, for someone who follows recipes perfectly, you really did a number on this." I mused. Emily crossed her arms, narrowing her eyes at me. "Are you trying to tell me I'm better at cooking than assembling furniture?" "I think the bookshelf is trying to tell you that," I said, gesturing to the crime scene in front of me. She huffed but didn't argue. Instead, she sat down on the floor next to me, watching as I worked. For a few minutes, the only sound in the room was the occasional scrape of a screwdriver against metal. Then, Emily sighed. I really appreciate this, you know. I glanced at her, seeing something softer in her expression. It's just a bookshelf, Emily. Not exactly a heroic act. It's not just about the bookshelf, she admitted. You've been around a lot lately. Checking in. Helping out. I don't know. It's nice. Something about the way she said it made my chest tighten. I didn't know how to respond. So I just focused on the task in front of me. A few more adjustments, and finally, the bookshelf stood perfectly straight. I sat back, satisfied. There, I said. Crisis averted. Your books are safe now. Emily grinned. You, sir, are a lifesaver. Just doing my part to protect literature. She laughed. A real, genuine laugh. It was the kind of sound that made me want to hear it again, over and over. And that realization was dangerous. Later that night, as I was getting ready to leave, Emily stood by the door, hesitating. Alex, she started, her voice softer than usual. I turned, waiting. Yeah. She bit her lip, then exhaled slowly. Do you ever feel like something's changing, but you don't know if it's a good thing or a bad thing? I felt my stomach twist, because I knew exactly what she meant, and I knew she wasn't talking about bookshelves. I said carefully, that change isn't always something you can put into a category like that. Sometimes it just happens, and we figure it out as we go. Emily nodded slowly, like she was letting the words settle. Yeah, maybe you're right. She looked like she wanted to say something else, something more, but instead, she just smiled faintly. Good night, Alex. Good night, Emily. I walked out of her house feeling like I had just stepped across a line, and I wasn't sure I wanted to go back. The next few days, I tried to act like everything was normal, like my thoughts weren't constantly drifting back to her. It didn't work, and it definitely didn't help when I got another text from Emily out of nowhere. Emily, hey, want to come over for dinner tonight? I promise I won't ask you to fix anything this time. I hesitated for half a second before typing back. Me, what's on the menu? Emily, homemade pasta. Me, you had me at homemade. That evening when I arrived, the house smelled amazing. The kind of warmth that made you forget the outside world for a little while. Emily was standing in the kitchen, her hair pulled back, stirring a pot of pasta sauce. You actually cook like this on a regular basis? I asked, leaning against the counter. She shrugged, smiling. Cooking is therapeutic for me. Then I should probably start cooking more, I muttered. She laughed. I'll teach you. Dinner was easy, comfortable, too comfortable. We talked about everything and nothing, the conversation flowing effortlessly. But beneath it all, there was something unspoken, something that neither of us had acknowledged yet, but we both felt. It wasn't just friendship anymore. At one point, Emily reached for something across the table, and her fingers brushed against mine. It was barely a touch, so small it could have been accidental. But it wasn't. Her eyes flickered up to meet mine, and for a second, the whole world shrank down to just that moment. Then she pulled her hand away, clearing her throat. But you want more wine? I exhaled, trying to shake off whatever had just happened. Yeah, sure. We didn't talk about it, but I knew she felt it too. As I was leaving that night, she walked me to the door again. This time, the silence between us was heavier. Then, just as I reached for the doorknob, Emily spoke. Alex, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I turned to face her. Yeah. She hesitated, her eyes searching mine. For a second, I thought she was going to say it, that she was going to break the unspoken tension that had been building between us for weeks. But instead, she just smiled faintly. Drive safe, okay? I nodded. Yeah. You too. As I stepped outside into the cool night air, I felt it again. That feeling that something was shifting between us. Something neither of us could ignore for much longer. The night that changed everything. The tension between us had become undeniable. It was in the way Emily and I gravitated toward each other at every family dinner, in the way our conversations stretched long into the night, in the way she'd linger by the door every time I was about to leave. It wasn't just friendship anymore. It hadn't been for a while. But we were both too cautious to say it out loud, too scared to cross a line that could change everything. And then, one night, something happened that neither of us could ignore. It had been a long day at work. My body ached from moving heavy boxes, and all I wanted to do was collapse on my bed and sleep for a week. Then, just as I was about to drop onto the couch, my phone buzzed. "Emily, hey, are you busy?" I stared at the screen, exhaustion warring with curiosity. "Me. Just got home. What's up?" There was a long pause before she replied. "Emily, can you come over?" Something in those 4 words made my exhaustion vanish instantly. I sat up, frowning. "Me? Everything okay?" Another pause. "Emily, I don't know." That was all I needed to see. I grabbed my keys and was out the door within minutes. When I arrived at her house, she was already waiting for me on the porch, arms wrapped around herself despite the mild night air. Her eyes were darker than usual, filled with something I couldn't quite place. Anxiety, maybe, or something heavier. "Emily," I said carefully as I stepped toward her. "What's wrong?" She exhaled sharply, looking down at the ground before meeting my gaze again. "I think someone tried to break in." My chest tightened. "What?" She swallowed. "The back door was open when I got home. And I swear I locked it this morning." Adrenaline shot through me. I immediately scanned the surroundings, my instincts kicking in. "Did you call the police?" She shook her head. "No, nothing's missing, and I didn't see anyone. But She hesitated. I just felt uneasy. I clenched my jaw. "Come on. Let's check it out." I followed her inside, my senses on high alert. The house was quiet, eerily so. I checked every door, every window, every room. Everything seemed normal, but that didn't mean nothing had happened. When I was satisfied that the place was secure, I returned to the living room to find Emily standing near the window, rubbing her arms absently. "You're safe," I told her gently. "I checked everything. But if you want, I can stay a while. Just in case." She turned to me, something shifting in her expression. Relief, gratitude, and something deeper, something I didn't dare name yet. "I don't want to be alone right now," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "You don't have to be." We sat on the couch, neither of us speaking for a while. The TV was on, playing some random late-night show, but neither of us was really watching. Emily curled her legs up underneath her, hugging a pillow to her chest. I could tell she was trying to shake off the unease, but it still lingered in the way her hands trembled slightly when she reached for her glass of water. Without thinking, I reached out and placed my hand over hers. She stiffened slightly, then exhaled, relaxing into the touch. "Thank you for coming," she murmured, looking down at our hands. I shrugged. "You don't have to thank me." She smiled faintly. Not a lot of people would drop everything just to make sure someone else felt safe. I didn't respond right away. Instead, I studied her, the way her hair fell over her shoulder, the way her eyes softened under the dim light. Before I could stop myself, I said, "I'd drop anything for you, Emily." Her breath hitched, her gaze met mine, and for a long moment, we just looked at each other. It was the closest we had ever come to acknowledging the truth. That something was happening between us, that we had been walking toward this moment for weeks, maybe even longer. And then, slowly, cautiously, Emily leaned forward. I didn't think. I didn't overanalyze. I just met her halfway. The moment our lips touched, the world seemed to shrink. It was soft at first, hesitant, as if neither of us could quite believe it was happening. But then, As the realization settled in, it deepened. Emily's fingers curled into my shirt, pulling me closer. My hand found the small of her back, anchoring her against me. It wasn't rushed. It wasn't desperate. It was slow, deliberate, like we were both trying to memorize every second of it. By the time we pulled apart, we were both breathless. Emily's forehead rested against mine, her fingers still tangled in my shirt. "This is probably a terrible idea," she whispered. "Probably," I agreed. Neither of us moved. Neither of us let go. And that was how I knew. We were past the point of pretending. This wasn't something we could ignore anymore. Something had changed, and there was no going back. The rest of the night was a blur of whispered conversations and quiet laughter. We didn't talk about what the kiss meant. Not yet. But we also didn't pull away from each other. At some point, Emily dozed off with her head resting against my shoulder. I stayed awake, listening to the sound of her breathing, feeling the warmth of her beside me. I didn't know what came next. I didn't know what this meant for us. But for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel lost. I just felt right. And I wasn't sure I wanted to fight that anymore. A step we can't undo. The clock ticked past midnight, but neither of us moved. Emily was still curled against me, her head resting lightly on my shoulder. The warmth of her body, the steady rhythm of her breathing. It all felt too natural, too easy. I didn't dare move, afraid that if I did, the spell would break and we'd be forced to face what had just happened. But I couldn't ignore the truth. We had crossed a line, and there was no going back. Somewhere around 2 a.m., Emily stirred. I felt her shift against me, her body tensing slightly as she realized where she was. Slowly, she sat up, rubbing her eyes. "Did I fall asleep on you?" she murmured, her voice still heavy with exhaustion. I smirked. "Yeah. I was starting to think I'd have to carry you to bed." She let out a sleepy chuckle, but there was something behind it, something hesitant. Then her eyes flickered up to mine, and the mood shifted again. We weren't just two people sitting on a couch anymore. We were two people who had kissed. Two people who had broken the unspoken rule we had been carefully tiptoeing around for weeks. Emily swallowed, her fingers tightening around the edge of the blanket she had pulled over her legs. "So, what now?" I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. "That's up to you." Her lips parted slightly, as if she had something to say, but then she hesitated. She was afraid. Not of me, but of what this meant, of what this could become. She trailed off, staring down at her hands. "This isn't just some casual thing, is it?" I shook my head. "No, it's not." She inhaled deeply, then let it out in a slow, controlled breath. "Alex, A loud noise from outside made her jump, and instantly, I was on alert. "What was that?" I asked, already standing. Emily followed me to the window, peeking through the curtains. Her street was quiet, the dim glow of streetlights casting long shadows across the pavement. But then, there it was again, a faint rustling near the back of her house. A bolt of unease shot through me. "I'm checking it out," I said, already moving toward the door. Emily grabbed my arm. "Be careful." I nodded, stepping outside into the cool night air. The silence was thick, pressing down on me as I made my way toward the back of the house. My eyes scanned the yard, searching for any sign of movement. Nothing. Just the rustling of leaves in the breeze. Just my own pulse hammering in my ears. After another slow sweep of the area, I exhaled. Maybe it was just the wind. Maybe the nerves from earlier had made Emily hear things. But I still didn't like it. When I walked back inside, I found her pacing the living room, chewing on her lip. "Anything?" she asked. I shook my head. "No, but you should double-check all the locks, just to be safe." She nodded, already moving toward the back door to secure it. I could see the tension in her shoulders, the way she was holding herself a little too stiffly. "You don't have to stay," she said quietly. "I don't want to keep you up." I crossed my arms. Emily, I'm not leaving you alone after that. She turned, meeting my gaze. Something in her expression softened, and for a moment, I saw the real reason she was so afraid. It wasn't just about tonight. It was everything. The divorce, the loneliness, the weight of carrying too much by herself for too long. I stepped closer. You don't have to do everything on your own, you know. She let out a small, almost bitter laugh. That's how I've always done things. Maybe it's time to change that, I said gently. She held my gaze for a long moment before finally nodding. Stay, she whispered. The couch wasn't the most comfortable place to sleep. But I didn't care. Emily had gone to bed a while ago, but I stayed up for a little while longer, just in case. I had no idea if there really had been someone outside, or if it was all just nerves, but either way, I wasn't taking chances. By the time I finally let my eyes close, the night felt strangely peaceful, like something had settled between us, like we had stopped running from whatever this was. The next morning, I woke to the smell of coffee and something warm draped over me. I blinked blearily, realizing Emily had covered me with a blanket sometime during the night. I sat up, rubbing the sleep from my eyes, as I saw her standing in the kitchen, pouring coffee into 2 mugs. Morning, she said softly, offering me one. Morning, I replied, taking it. She hesitated, then sat down on the couch beside me. For a moment, we just sipped our coffee in silence. Then, finally, she spoke. Last night wasn't just a moment, was it? I set my mug down, turning to face her fully. No, Emily, it wasn't. She let out a slow breath, nodding. I don't know how to do this, she admitted. I don't know what happens next. Then let's figure it out together, I said simply. She looked at me, her expression unreadable. Then, slowly, she smiled. Okay, she whispered. And just like that, the line we had been afraid to cross was gone. And neither of us wanted to go back. The weight of the unspoken. The days after that night felt like stepping into a new reality. Emily and I didn't talk about what had happened, not in words, at least. But the change was undeniable. It was in the way she lingered a little longer when we said goodbye, in the way her eyes softened when they met mine. It was in the small touches that neither of us seemed to second-guess anymore. A hand on my arm, fingers brushing when she passed me a coffee mug, the way she sat just a little closer than she used to. It was in the silence, the kind that was no longer awkward but filled with something unspoken, something fragile and real. But with that shift came uncertainty. Because even though we were closer than ever, there was still a wall between us. And I wasn't sure how much longer we could avoid the conversation waiting on the other side. One evening, my mom invited Emily over for dinner again. It wasn't unusual. She had been doing it more often lately, especially after learning about Emily's break-in scare. But tonight felt different. Maybe it was because of what had happened between us. Maybe it was because Emily and I both knew, deep down, that we weren't just friends anymore. Whatever the reason, I felt the weight of my mom's gaze on me more than once throughout the night. She wasn't stupid. She could sense something had changed. Emily must have felt it too because she was quieter than usual. She still laughed at my mom's jokes, still responded when spoken to, but there was something cautious in the way she carried herself, like she was trying not to give anything away. And the more I saw it, the more I hated it. I didn't want to tiptoe around this. I didn't want to pretend. But what choice did we have? After dinner, I offered to walk Emily to her car. It had become a habit now, a quiet excuse to get a few moments alone before she left. The night air was cool, carrying the faint scent of rain. The streetlights cast long shadows across the pavement as we walked in silence. Emily was the first to speak. Your mom's starting to suspect something, isn't she? I let out a breath. Yeah, probably. She nodded, glancing down at her hands. What do you think she'd say, if she knew? I didn't answer right away. I had thought about it plenty of times. But the truth was, I didn't know. My mom adored Emily. She had been part of our lives for years. But this, whatever this was different. It wasn't just a friendship anymore. And I wasn't sure how she'd feel about that. I think I started choosing my words carefully. She'd probably be surprised. But I don't think she'd be angry. Emily let out a soft laugh. But there was no humor in it. That's still a risk, though, isn't it? The way people might see this. She didn't have to elaborate. I knew what she meant. The age gap, the fact that she had been a family friend for so long, the way it might look to outsiders. It wasn't like we were doing anything wrong. We were both adults. We weren't hurting anyone. But the world didn't always see things that way. I don't care what people think. I said honestly, I care about you. Emily's breath caught. And for a moment, she looked at me like she wasn't sure whether to believe me. Then quietly, she said, I just don't want to be something you regret later. The words hit harder than I expected. I took a step closer, forcing her to meet my eyes. Emily, look at me. She hesitated, then did. I could never regret you, I said firmly. Not now. Not ever. She searched my face, and for a moment I thought she might cry. But then she nodded, exhaling a breath she had probably been holding for days. Okay, she whispered. We stood there for a moment longer, the night stretching between us. Then finally, Emily reached for my hand, lacing her fingers through mine. It was the first time we had done something like that out in the open. And neither of us let go. A few days later, I got a text from Emily. Emily, come over. There was no explanation, no context. Just 2 words. And somehow, that was all I needed. When I arrived, she was waiting for me on the porch again. But this time, there was no hesitation in her expression. She stepped forward before I could say anything, wrapped her arms around me, and buried her face in my chest. I held her without question, feeling the way her body trembled slightly. Emily, I murmured. What happened? She pulled back just enough to meet my eyes. I told someone about us. My heart skipped. Who? She hesitated. A friend. Someone from work. She didn't take it well. I exhaled sharply, already knowing where this was going. What did she say? Emily bit her lip, her gaze dropping. That I should be careful. That it's not normal. That I should think about what people will assume. I felt something dark coil in my chest. Emily. I know. She cut in, shaking her head. I know it doesn't matter what they think. But it still hurt hearing it. Because a part of me wondered if maybe she was right. I took her face between my hands, forcing her to focus on me. She's not right. I said firmly. Emily, what we have, it's real. And I'm not letting some judgmental stranger make you doubt that. Her lower lip trembled, but then she nodded. And that was all it took for me to kiss her again. This time, there was no hesitation, no second guessing. Just her and me, standing in the doorway of her house, the weight of the world fading away. When we finally pulled apart, her forehead rested against mine. Okay, she whispered. I smiled. Yeah, she murmured. I don't care what anyone else says. I want this. Relief crashed over me. Me too. She took a deep breath, as if she were finally allowing herself to let go of the fear that had been holding her back. Then, taking my hand, she pulled me inside. And for the first time since this all started, we didn't look back. A love worth fighting for. For the first time in weeks, there were no more questions hanging between us. No more hesitation. No more pretending. Emily and I had crossed the invisible line we had been dancing around for so long, and there was no going back. But as much as it felt right, undeniably, impossibly right, I knew this was only the beginning of the real challenge. Because now, the world would know, and not everyone would understand. The morning after our kiss in the doorway, I woke up with a strange mix of calm and anticipation. I had fallen asleep on Emily's couch, my arm slung lazily over the backrest, my mind still caught somewhere between dreams and the reality of what had finally happened. Sunlight streamed through the half-open curtains, bathing the room in soft gold. The smell of coffee drifted in from the kitchen, and I could hear Emily moving around, humming lightly to herself. I stretched, rubbing my face before sitting up. She turned when she heard me, a small, amused smile playing on her lips. "Morning, sleepyhead." "Morning," I replied, voice still rough with sleep. "You let me sleep here." Emily shrugged, leaning against the counter. "You looked comfortable, and I figured you needed the rest after. Everything. Everything." I knew exactly what she meant. I stood, making my way toward her, and without thinking, I wrapped my arms around her from behind. She let out a soft laugh, but leaned into the touch, resting her hands over mine. This was what I had been waiting for. No more fear, no more pretending we were just friends. Just us. "I like this," she murmured. "Yeah." She turned in my arms, looking up at me. "Yeah." I kissed her forehead, then her temple, lingering there for a moment. But as much as I wanted to freeze time and stay like this forever, we both knew what was coming next. The outside world. My mom. Our friends. The inevitable questions. Emily exhaled, as if she could hear my thoughts. "We should talk to your mom." I pulled back slightly, watching her face. "You really want to do this now?" She bit her lip, nodding. "It's going to happen eventually, and I'd rather it come from us." I couldn't argue with that. So I nodded. "All right, let's do it." The drive to my house was quiet. Not awkward, not tense, just quiet. Emily was lost in thought, staring out the window, while I drummed my fingers against the steering wheel. It was strange, this feeling of being on the edge of something that could change my entire life. By the time we pulled into the driveway, my heart was pounding. Emily let out a slow breath. No turning back now. "Do you want to?" I asked. "Turn back." She turned to me, eyes steady. "No." I took her hand, gave it a small squeeze, then led her inside. My mom was in the kitchen, humming along to some old song playing on the radio. She turned when she saw us, her expression warm but curious. "Well, good morning, you two," she said, drying her hands on a dish towel. "Morning," I said, glancing at Emily. She hesitated, then stepped forward. "We need to talk." My mom arched a brow. "That sounds serious." "It is," I admitted. She studied us for a moment, then motioned for us to sit. I wasn't sure how to start, so Emily did. She took a deep breath. "Your son and we've been spending a lot of time together. And somewhere along the way, things changed." There it was, out in the open. My mom didn't react right away. She simply tilted her head, as if processing the words carefully. Then she let out a small, knowing sigh. "I was wondering when you were going to tell me." I blinked. "Wait, you knew." She shot me a dry look. "I'm your mother, Alex." Of course I knew. "I've seen the way you look at her." Emily stiffened beside me. "You're not upset?" My mom was silent for a long moment before speaking. "I'm not upset," she said carefully, "but I am surprised. This wasn't something I ever saw coming." "Neither did we." But she continued, looking between us, "I just want to know one thing." Emily swallowed. "What's that?" "Are you happy?" Emily's grip tightened on my hand. "Yes," she said, without hesitation. "I am." My mom's gaze softened. "Then that's all I need to know." Relief crashed over me so fast I nearly laughed. "You're really okay with this?" I asked. She exhaled, shaking her head with a wry smile. "Look, it's not what I expected, but life rarely turns out the way we expect it to. So if this is what makes you both happy, then who am I to argue?" Emily let out a breath, her shoulders sagging. "Thank you," she said softly. My mom reached across the table, squeezing her hand. "Just take care of each other, Okay. I met Emily's gaze, and for the first time in a long time, there was no doubt in her eyes. "We will," I promised. Telling my mom had been the biggest hurdle. But as the weeks passed, it became clear that not everyone was as understanding. Some friends were supportive. Others weren't. There were whispers, side glances. Emily had coworkers who suddenly stopped inviting her out for lunch. I had a few friends who made offhanded jokes that didn't sit right. But through it all, we stood together. Because at the end of the day, none of it mattered. Not the stares, not the judgment, not the opinions of people who had no right to tell us how to live our lives. What mattered was this: the way Emily fit so perfectly into my arms. The way she made even the worst days feel lighter. The way she smiled at me like I was something worth holding on to. And I was. So was she. And no matter what came next, I knew one thing for certain. This wasn't a mistake. This was love. And I wasn't letting it go.